Hello, my name is Reverend Robert Lewis. I'm pastor of Hinton Avenue United Methodist Church in Charlottesville, Virginia. Today I would like to share with you a presentation on lynching and the death penalty and the forgotten history of capital punishment. The Commonwealth of Virginia has executed 113 offenders since 1976 and has just 2 remaining on death row as of January 2021. As the General Assembly considers repeal of the death penalty in Virginia, we have an opportunity to recognize the darkest parts of our history and to acknowledge the continuing pain and injustice caused by the open secret of racial terror lynchings. As people of faith, we have a responsibility to challenge white supremacy in one of its most lethal and pernicious forms. To understand the real meaning and function of the death penalty, we have to uncover the truth of racial terror lynchings in America. In 2017, Charlottesville's clergy were recognized nationwide for their efforts to organize and lead the community in resisting this white supremacist violence. Once the violence subsided, clergy continued to offer themselves in support of their community, seeking to bridge divisions and heal divides. In 2018, clergy took part in leading a civil rights pilgrimage to Montgomery, Alabama, to memorialize John Henry James, a victim of racial terror lynching in Albemarle County, Virginia. This pilgrimage, organized by Dr. Jelaine Schmidt of the University of Virginia and Dr. Andrea Douglas of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, was part of the Equal Justice Initiative's Community Remembrance Project. This project seeks to discover those stories of racial terror lynchings across the South, to hold them in community so that they can be acknowledged and heard, and to memorialize their victims. The Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, collaborates with communities across the country to memorialize documented victims of racial violence and to foster meaningful dialogues about race and justice. In July 2017, over 100 members of Charlottesville's community traveled to learn together about the history of civil rights in our nation and to deliver soil from the site of Mr. James' lynching to the Equal Justice Initiative's Memorial for Peace and Justice. Led by its founder, Brian Stevenson, the Equal Justice Initiative has done groundbreaking work in uncovering and sharing the truth about the history of racial terror in America, as well as the present state of our mass incarceration system. Researchers working with the Equal Justice Initiative have documented over 4,000 racial terror lynchings of African Americans between 1877 and 1950 in 12 southern states, including Virginia. They've discovered many more documented cases of lynchings in states outside of these 12. Although portrayed as efforts to bring dangerous criminals to justice, lynching was actually a method of terrorism used to enforce racial subordination and segregation of African American communities. Lynchings were often violent and public events that traumatized whole black communities. They were tolerated by state and federal officials, sometimes even aided and abetted, and they shaped the geographic, social, political, and economic conditions still evident across the country today. Racial terror lynchings played a key role in the forced migration of millions of black Americans out of the South. The Great Migration was the largest scale resistance to lynching in the United States, and refugees from the South now populate many urban areas. Based in the stereotype of black criminality, lynching reinforced a narrative of racial difference and a legacy of inequality still evident in the mass incarceration system, in racially based capital punishment, in excessive sentencing, in disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, and in police abuse of people of color. As Americans, we are quite adept at erasing our history. Although we've gone to great lengths to erect markers and monuments to memorialize the Confederacy and its soldiers, there is an astonishing absence of any effort to acknowledge, discuss, or address lynching. Civil War heroes were not the only history that was available to be portrayed, and yet we have chosen to ignore the experiences of more than half the population in many places in the South. This short video presentation from the Equal Justice Initiative helps us to understand the history and context of racial terror lynching. Constructing stereotypes to exploit the loopholes of the 13th Amendment, whites defended vigilante justice against black people as a necessary tactic of self-preservation to protect their property, their families, and most of all, the Southern way of life from dangerous, violent black criminals. The dominant political narrative blamed lynching on its victims, insisting that this brutal mob violence was the only appropriate response to the scourge of black men raping white women. Despite the myth of protecting women's virtue, anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells discovered that in all the lynchings conducted in 1892, less than 1/3 of the allegations leading to the lynching were actually related to rape. Despite its portrayal in the white press, lynching was not used as a tool for crime control. Instead, lynching was a form of racial control, wielded almost exclusively by white mobs against African American victims, frequently with complete disregard for or even participation by the legal justice system. Lynching racialized criminality. African Americans were assigned a presumption of guilt. Lynchings were usually reported as being conducted by persons unknown, despite the fact that in a small community, nearly everyone might be there. Very few white people were convicted of murder for lynching a black person in America. Of all the lynchings that occurred after 1900, only 1% resulted in a lyncher being convicted of a criminal offense. Lynchings were often public spectacles that involved advanced publicity. Large crowds, including women and children, who often participated. Festive atmospheres with food and merriment. Prolonged torture. Mutilation and dismemberment. Seeking of souvenirs. Taking of photos. And burning at the stake. These vigilantes persisted despite the fact that Southern states were equipped with fully functioning criminal justice systems that were often eager to punish African American defendants with steep fines, long imprisonment, terms of forced labor for state profit, and legal execution. Southern states exploited the 13th Amendment. The amendment stated that slavery was prohibited save for those who were convicted of crimes. Therefore, the states passed black codes and convict leasing laws that branded black people as criminals and facilitated their re-enslavement for state profit. Convicted As public sentiment against lynching rose, the states themselves argued the need to satisfy the bloodlust of the angry mobs. Lynching's decline relied heavily on the increased use of capital punishment by the southern states. Only in 1915 did court-ordered executions outpace lynchings in the former slave states for the very first time. 2/3 of those executed in the 1930s were black. As the threat of public lynching subsided mid-century, and as African Americans and others began to assert their civil rights, racialized terror continued. Violence, threats, and intimidation against African Americans whenever they transgressed social boundaries or asserted their civil rights were commonplace. Often there was no recourse or protection from the justice system. Even today, the state's reliance on capital punishment bears a close resemblance to the pattern of racial terror lynchings in years past. Following the Great Migration, African American population in the South fell to 22% between 1910 and 1950, and yet still African Americans constituted 75% of the South's executions. Today, African Americans make up less than 13% of the nation's population, but nearly 42% of those on death row are black, and 34% of those executed since 1976 have been black. What's more, when researchers study the relationship between race and the death penalty, they find an overwhelming pattern of discrimination based either on the race of the victim, the race of the defendant, or both. Those who kill white people are much more likely to face the death penalty than those who kill black people. Black people who kill are much more likely to face the death penalty than white people who kill. In 1987, the Supreme Court saw evidence in McCleskey v. Kemp that indicated Georgia decision-makers were more than 4 times as likely to impose death for the killing of a white person than a black person. In Houston County, Alabama, prosecutors have been found to have excluded 80% of qualified African Americans from juries in death penalty cases. Across the South, black defendants are most often tried by juries of white peers, even in majority black areas. Between 1889 and 1918, more than 8 in 10 American lynchings took place in the South. And since 1976, more than 8 in 10 of the nearly 1,400 legal executions have been in the South. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 contained sweeping provisions designed to eliminate discrimination in voting, in education, in employment, it did not address discrimination in criminal justice. On the
2 this morning. Brian Stevenson is a living example.
Sunday in 2018, when we were on our pilgrimage to Montgomery, I preached a sermon linking John Henry James's murder, our trip, and the present-day struggles for equality.
2 this morning. Brian Stevenson is a living example of that kind of ministry. A ministry that is born of grace, that comes alongside the stories and the lives of people as they're living them and offers them another story, God's story. Offers them a story of reconciliation and of truth. Brian Stevenson was just a young lawyer when he founded the Equal Justice Initiative. He was concerned for the plight of those who were unjustly convicted, particularly those who were on death row. As he began to practice and work among them, he realized how many people there are whose convictions or whose sentencing just might be unfair. They've not all been overturned, but many have through Brian's work. One in particular that he explores in depth in his book, Just Mercy, is the story of Walter McMillan. Walter was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of a young white woman, murdered in a dry cleaning store in Monroeville, Alabama. Walter was convicted primarily on the testimony of one man whose story kept changing, who wove a wild and ever-shifting tale, not just of a single murder, but of a criminal conspiracy involving him and Walter and some other ringleader that he couldn't identify and no one ever found. Mr. McMillan was kept on death row prior to being convicted and sentenced to death. Instead of being held in the county lockup while awaiting his trial, he was actually taken to and housed on death row to impress upon him the truth of who he was and what would be his fate. When he did go to trial, it only lasted a day and a half. There were 3 witnesses. They testified against him, but the jury ignored the dozens of African American witnesses who all testified that at the time of the murder, Walter was there with them at a church fish fry being held in his own front yard. The trial judge overrode the jury's sentencing verdict that Walter be given life in prison. Instead, the judge sentenced Walter to death. But Bryan Stevenson heard of Walter's plight, took on the case after the conviction, and worked tirelessly for years and years to gather the evidence, to assemble the records, to examine the facts, and eventually to prove that the state's witnesses had lied on the stand committing perjury and were now willing to say so. The prosecution had suppressed exculpatory evidence. They had concealed from Walter's own defense team the evidence that they held that proved he was innocent of the crime. It was indeed a criminal conspiracy, only it was within the justice system that had put Walter on death row, even before he had his trial. In 1993, Walter McMillan's conviction was overturned by the Alabama Court of Appeals, and prosecutors agreed that the case had been mishandled. Walter was released in 1993 after spending 6 long years on death row for a crime that he didn't commit. When Walter came out of the penitentiary and had the chance to breathe fresh air again, he spread his arms and he waved them like a bird, flapping its wings. He said, how good it is to finally be free. Walter was finally brought to freedom. He was brought to the truth. Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative have a lifelong commitment to the truth. They're the group who constructed the new memorial to peace and justice in Alabama. They have a mission there to tell the truth about the plague of racial terror lynchings that swept this country between 1877 and 1950, when over 4,400 lynchings can be documented, and so many more took place that we'll never even know. They want to impress upon us all the truth of the impact of these horrible acts of racial terror on communities, white and black, at that time and down to the present day. They want to help us to come to grips with the truth so that we can experience healing and reconciliation. But first we have to acknowledge the trauma. We have to acknowledge the violence. We have to acknowledge the pain that we've not been willing to admit is there, but doesn't just vanish, both in the communities that were victimized, but also in the perpetrators of the violence. Violence twists our souls. That trauma, that violence, that pain seeps into our system and it builds up like lead contamination in the water. It has horrible effects that distort the development of individuals, of families, of societies down through the generations. The need to tame the primal violence of racial terror lynchings gave way to convict leasing, selling businesses the unpaid labor of convicted criminals, and that blossomed into the for-profit prison industry that we have today. It gave rise to widespread support for the death penalty by elected judges so that they could prove to voters that they were tough on crime and that they were able to retain law and order by delivering a swift and a final punishment before it could be taken into the hands of unruly mobs. The legacy of racial terror lynchings is still alive and well in society today. Through mass incarceration and the school-to-prison pipeline, and unequal sentencing and biased policing, the rush to convict and to punish that insisted that Walter McMillan was in his place on death row. In Charlottesville, we want to confront that history. We want to tell the truth about it. We want to acknowledge the pain of all that has happened and seek to build bridges of healing. That's why I'm on a bus today with Mayor Walker, with Susan Breaux, and with 100 other folks from our neighborhoods on the way to Alabama, carrying with us a sample of soil from, as near as we can tell, the site of the racial terror lynching of John Henry James. Mr. James was accused on July 11, 1898, of criminally assaulting Miss Julia Hottop outside the gate of her home near Charlottesville when she got off the horse to unlock the gate. He was charged for the assault and he was arrested. And then that night he was taken out of the jail through a basement window, over a fence, sneaking in the cover of darkness, put on a train, and moved to jail in Stanton for fear of a lynching mob. The next day he was scheduled to stand trial here in Charlottesville's court. According to the Alexandria Gazette, the prisoner left Stanton at 10 o'clock on the morning in charge of Chief of Police Frank Parrish and Lucian Watts, Sheriff of the county. When the train was nearing Woods Crossing, about 4 miles west of Charlottesville, this is around where the Boar's Head is today. When the train was nearing Woods Crossing, the officers noticed a crowd at the station. As soon as the train slowed up, a number of men, unmasked, boarded the platforms of the car, front and rear. All were armed with pistols and seemed to be 150 in the crowd. The mob seized James, and when they reached the platform, a rope was thrown over James's neck, and then James was carried about 400 yards to a small locust tree. He was hung up on that tree after being allowed to pray for 20 minutes. Then, as his body hung there elevated above the crowd, after he was dead, his body was riddled by bullets. According to the Richmond Planet, the body of James was left hanging on the tree about 2 hours. Hundreds of people visited the scene this afternoon. Many of them gathered relics of the occasion, taking some portions of his clothing and body. While all of this was taking place, the grand jury in Charlottesville met, just as if John Henry James were present, and it handed down its verdict: guilty. This is just one example of the sorts of things that have taken place and across our country in the era after Reconstruction that we've come to know as Jim Crow. We are taking the memory of this lynching, the truth of what happened in our hometown, to that memorial, to peace and justice, so that we might own up to what has happened. When we come back from our trip, we're going to return to establish a memorial to John Henry James here in town, so that we can publicly and openly acknowledge that pain, so that we might invite God to step into the truth of our story. Those of us who are on this trip will surely grow in deeper relationship with one another, but more importantly, we seek to come back to this community and invite folks to engage in these first steps of reconciliation and healing, of growing in deeper relationship with one another across racial and economic lines, as we step gently and gingerly together into God's mercy and God's grace. And not everybody will, and that's to be expected. But we have an opportunity to build the kinds of bridges of grace and mercy, of justice and of truth that Charlottesville still so desperately needs.
And justice. I'd like to share a clip of that. Since July of 2020, the federal government has executed 13 people including a black man convicted by an all-white jury, 2 young black men who were teenagers at the time of their crimes, a black man whose evidence of intellectual disability the court refused to examine, 5 other people of color, the only Native American and the only woman under a federal death sentence. That sermon with you now. At present, more than half of the 50 people under federal death sentence are people of color. 21 of those are black, 7 of those are Latino. The connections between the history of racialized terror and lynchings and the racialized nature of our criminal justice system, especially in the imposition of the death penalty, can only be seen if we fully understand the history that has taken place. Often, white communities have chosen to forget or suppress these stories. Black communities remember them all too well, but are too traumatized to speak about them. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King reminds us that darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, and violence multiplies violence. And toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. It's time to re-examine our history and hear these untold stories in an atmosphere of understanding, compassion, and love, with a firm commitment to work together to build a more just and peaceful future. Now you have an opportunity to reflect on what you know about the history of racial terror in our Commonwealth and in our country, and how it continues to impinge upon our lives and our communities. You have a chance to reflect on what you can do to confront the history we have so long avoided, and allow it to spur us toward a future in which we are as intentional about dismantling racism as our forebears were in constructing it.